So there are two questions that I have for Tony Ressler. Okay. And it's not that complicated. Okay. But here's the couple of things that I want to know from Tony Ressler going into the offseason. Okay. So if I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna put the Wonder Woman lasso of truth around Tony Ressler, and I'm gonna sit down and ask him these two questions. Here's what I want to know. Okay. Number one, are we going into the luxury tax this season? Now, I know what Tony Ressler has said in the past about the idea of, well, we'll go in the luxury tax when it makes sense and blah, 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 blah. Okay, that's all fine and dandy. Okay. But that doesn't solve the immediacy of, are we going in the luxury tax now? Because when you look at this roster, if you just take the core group of players that the Hawks have, they're going into the luxury tax with DeAndre Hunter, Trey, Capella, Collins, everybody that is just the core group of the players. Without adding anybody to this roster, they're in the luxury tax. And I understand that, we're collaborative, we're communicative, we're, all these buzzwords that we have as far as what our organization is and things like that. But I need to know, am I going in the luxury tax this year? My buddy Brad Rowland talked about this on my radio show last night. It's hard to get good and cheap, right? It's hard to get good and build a better roster without spending money and with cutting payroll. That's a hard thing to do. And so if the Hawks are not willing to get into the luxury tax, then they're going to have to move on from a Collins or a Capella or a Hunter. They're going to have to move on from at least one of those pieces to get themselves under the luxury tax threshold. So that's the first question that I want to know. Tony Ressler, are you going in the luxury tax this year? Not when it's, the right time, not when it's, makes sense and all the, not when it's collaborative, not when it's communicative. Are you going in the luxury tax this year? That's my first question. Then my second question to Tony Ressler would be, Tony, where is Quin Snyder in the pecking order of decision making as far as how the roster is going to be constructed? Now, I know that the Hawks mantra from Landry Fields and everybody, in between, we've heard from, Tony Ressler and things like that. Oh, well, Quin Snyder is just here to coach. Okay. All right. Can I tell you that I don't believe that bunk, bull, and malarkey for just a second? I don't believe in all that. Listen, the way you got Quin Snyder to come off the beach, off a vacation, to come coach this team 3/4 of the season, okay, when you basically just had a handful of games that were left, 21 games that were left in the regular season and the playoffs, okay, the way you got him to come here and be a part of this organization was to promise him some kind of personnel decision, say, whether it was, again, I don't think it's going to be president of basketball operations, but something to have an influence over this roster, because that's the one thing that he did not get when he was in Utah. The one thing that, and I talked to the play-by-play guy, I talked to the beat writers, the one thing that they said was that he did not have any real say in how the roster was going to be constructed. And that's something that Quin Snyder wanted to have a hand in. Now, excuse me, as far as what level of hand that he's going to have involved, I don't know. I mean, could I believe that he has final say over the roster when it's all said and done? I could believe that. Okay. Do I believe that if it's Landry Fields, Kyle Korver, Nick Ressler, and then Quin Snyder, that he is a little bit down on the pecking order? I could sort of believe that as well. But the idea that he's not going to have a definite influence on this roster, I'm not buying that for a second. So when I look at this, and again, I don't care if Quin Snyder has his stamp all over this roster. I don't care if Quin Snyder is the guy who, yes, Landry Fields has the general manager title and the president of basketball operations title. But if Quin Snyder's pulling the strings behind the scene, I don't really care. Here's my thing. I just want it right. Okay. Like, I don't want to know how to make the watch. I just want to know what time it is. I don't want the labor pains. I just want the baby. And that's all I want at the end of the day. I just want this thing fixed. I just want to know that this team is going to be better when all is said and done. And if they think they're going to be better because Quin Snyder's pulling the strings, okay, fine. But this idea that they've sold on, well, he's just here to coach and different. Okay, he's not just here to coach. You don't pay a guy. You don't pay a guy who's had moderate success in the NBA, championship caliber coach money. And look, he was making the same kind of money that Nick Nurse, Budenholzer, Spoelstra, guys that have won championships. He was paid at that kind of level. And I don't think it was just a money grab. I certainly don't think that Quin Snyder was desperate for the money or he needed the money. He didn't need to come off the beach of wherever he was at and come coach this ragtag bunch of players. So I definitely think that there is going to be a strong influence. And we all heard about, the reason he's here now is because we want him to get into that. Okay, well, if you want him to evaluate the players, but you're not going to give him any personnel decision, what sense does that make? He could have done that. He could have done that coming into the summertime. But I don't buy this whole notion that Quin Snyder's just here to coach, as we've heard. I don't buy this thing that, well, he's just kind of he's going to have a definite say in personnel. He's definitely going to have a say in what goes on with this Atlanta Hawks roster, whether that's at the very top, whether that's somewhere in the middle, but he's going to have a definite influence as to how this roster is going to be constructed. So again, the two questions I want for Tony Ressler: are we going in the luxury tax next year? Not when it's convenient, not when it makes sense. Are we going in the luxury tax next year? And then number two is, where is Quin Snyder in the pecking order of personnel roster decision making when all is said and done? If I can get the answer to those two questions, then I'll have a better understanding about where this Hawks franchise is headed. Where is it going to end up? What is their mindset? Do they think they're a contender? Do they think they're a pretender? If I can get those two questions answered from Tony Ressler, I'll feel like that the Hawks are either more on solid footing or, maybe more on quicksand when all is said and done. We thank you so much for making Hittin' Hard your first listen every day. Make sure when you listen in that you go into our comment section of whatever platform that you're on and leave us a comment that you are an everyday listener. So if you're watching on YouTube, listening on one of our platforms, go in, leave us a comment, and let us know that you are an everydayer, as we like to say, an everyday listener to the program. So we thank you people greatly for being a part of our ever-growing community. So we thank you so much for always listening in and being that everyday listener to our shows.